Please pray with me. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of each heart be acceptable to you, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. This parable about the lost sheep is one of my favorite stories Jesus tells. I love any story involving animals. Many of you know that I have a real soft spot in my heart for our dog named Scooter. I can't imagine life without that little guy. He's 10 and a half, so I know he's not going to be around forever. And so I try to cherish every little thing about him while I still have him, even when he's being naughty or even when he won't go outside when it's raining. And I share my love for my dog Scooter with all of you because I think that if Jesus were to retell this parable today, I think that he would use an analogy of pets versus sheep because, we don't really have sheep anymore. We don't know much about them in our daily lives. And I think that Jesus would retell this parable in a way that connected with us because that's exactly what Jesus did in his day. The lengths that we go to find a missing pet, to search for them and the joy of bringing them home again. I think that Jesus would understand and connect with our love of pets, but people didn't have pets back then, at least not the way that we do now. Sheep herding in Jesus's day was much more commonplace. In the northern part of Israel, in the Galilee region of Israel, they had some sheep, but not very many. It was mostly agricultural. They grew wheat and barley and grapes in the north, but in the south, they had a lot of sheep. And the same is still true today. In my own travels to Palestine and Israel, I saw real shepherds. They're known as Bedouins there. And it's very common that you'll see them out in the fields with their flocks of sheep. Now, they're not out in green pastures like the ones we might see in our mind's eye, like the ones we have here in the Midwest. Remember that the southern half of Israel is the Judean desert. It's right next to the Dead Sea. And so as you look out to see the shepherds with their sheep, it looks like they're just in a bunch of sand, and you wonder what the sheep could possibly be eating out there in the desert. But if you look closely, there are these small patches, these small places of gathering of small plants. And so you'll usually see the shepherd atop a hill, and they're overlooking this vast wilderness, both to watch for predators and also to spot the places with the most number of small greenery in that area. And then the shepherd guides the sheep to those places, and that's where they graze for the day. When I was there, I met a Bedouin family who had 6 sheep. That was their entire flock. And that actually is pretty accurate for what it would have been like in Jesus's day. Shepherds didn't usually have 100 sheep. They might have had 10 or maybe 20. A particularly wealthy shepherd would have maybe 30 sheep. And on rare occasions, very rare, you'd see someone with 100 sheep, but they had several shepherds working with them to cover the land in which the animals needed to graze. But this story really isn't about sheep and shepherds. It's imagery Jesus uses to describe God and God's people. And really, this is about us, a story about us as human beings. This is our story. And so we share some things in common with those sheep. One of the similarities is that sheep are social creatures just like us. Sheep have a herd mentality, and so they tend to flock together. Sheep like to stay in the flock because it helps keep them safe. And they prefer to be with the flock. And so there's no real one lead sheep. They prefer to be in their little pack, but they're all just kind of wandering about in the field together. So the sheep actually like having a shepherd because it makes them feel safe and they know where to go. It's the shepherd who can look out for them and to lead them beside the still cool waters and to make them, to help them find the green pastures. So sheep have something similar to us as humans. And another thing is that the grass is always greener on the other side of the pasture. I knew a sheep farmer from a church I served in a rural area several years ago, and they once told me, yeah, I've got a pretty good sized pasture, but he said, no matter how big the pasture is, and no matter how green the pasture is, one of those sheep is always going to be found right along that fence line. And whenever they can find just a little bit of an opening, the sheep is going to squeeze its way to the other side, and it's going to leave the other sheep behind. It doesn't mean to. The sheep's not trying to get lost. It's not fun for them. It's actually quite distressing if a sheep is separated from their flock when it finds itself alone. But it's always looking The sheep is always looking, grass is greener over there. And how we have that in common with the sheep. And for many of us, we spend most of our lives wishing that we could be somebody else, with someone else, doing something else, living someplace else, tending to some other problem other than our own. And that's the mentality of those sheep. He said, I always can tell when a sheep's gotten away because there's these little tufts of wool stuck to the fence where they've squeezed their way through the other side. And even though sheep prefer to be around other sheep in the flock, he said, what ends up happening is that the sheep nibble their way lost. They don't mean to, they don't want to leave the flock, but they begin to nibble a little bit here, then a little bit there, and a little bit more. They move further and further away. And without even thinking, before they even realize it, maybe hours later, the sheep looks around and they realize that they're all alone. They can't see the other sheep. They can't see the shepherd. And so they begin to bleat out loud, but there's no one around to come rescue them. And for many of us, there are points in our lives when we too find ourselves lost. Sometimes it's because we've wandered away from God. We can be like the sheep who nibble our way lost slowly and by degrees. There are times we make poor choices that lead us further and further down a path we never meant to go. And so part of this parable is about a sheep who wandered away. Why did it wander away? Well, it just nibbled itself lost, little by little. We understand this. The prophet Isaiah understood that this is simply part of who we are as human beings. In Isaiah 53:6, it says, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way. And remember that when Jesus is telling a parable, he's telling our story. So at some point in our lives, we all have wandered away from God. It might have been in college or at some other point in our lives, but all of us have been or will be lost at some point. I remember several years ago, I was talking to a parishioner and they said they got sick. And when they got sick, they weren't able to come to church. But when they got better, for whatever reason, they didn't come back to church. And then after a while, they forgot what it was like to be around other people. They forgot the sound of the shepherd's voice. They've forgotten how good it felt to be together. And they no longer remembered what it was like and how wonderful it was to have God's rod and staff comforting them. Until one day they realized how left their life went. And they had to ask themselves the question, how did I get so lost? It's often in those little decisions, those seemingly small choices we make in everyday living that can lead our lives astray, one little bite at a time, where we start to wander away. And other times, it's through no fault of our own. It's not anything you've done. It's simply the accumulation of circumstances of life. And sometimes you can't even say for sure. You don't really know how you got yourself into this place. All you know is how lonely and disconnected you might feel when you're not quite sure what to do or where to go. And so you begin to ask yourself, what happened? How in the world did I get so lost? And that's what we find in the sheep. Now remember that the wilderness is vast, it's wild. I've shared with you before that the Judean wilderness is rugged and rocky and rough. There are high cliffs and low valleys. In fact, in King David's time, when he wrote the 23rd Psalm, he would have called it the dark valley or the valley of the shadow of death. And that's the area that the sheep would have wandered off into. That's where the wild animals were. And in today's reading, Jesus has been ministering to the tax collectors. And Jesus finds that those tax collectors and other sinners are drawn to him. He understands himself to be shepherding and to trying to reach these lost sheep. And this is happening. The religious people begin to get upset. And they're irritated that Jesus is spending so much time with these sinners and these tax collectors. They're upset because religious leaders had this idea that God wants people to be pure and holy. That is, God wanted to distance themselves from sins and sinners as much as possible. But Jesus doesn't do that. Instead, he eats with sinners. He goes into their home. These were his friends. And so it's in this context to these Pharisees and scribes who are grumbling that Jesus tells them this story. He looks at them and says, a shepherd had 100 sheep, and one of the sheep wandered away. Now, if that was you, wouldn't you leave the other 99% behind and then go out in search of the wilderness for that one sheep? And when you find that one sheep, wouldn't you rejoice? These are rhetorical questions, right? Like, wouldn't you? But here's the thing. With the religious leaders, the answer was, well, no. If that sheep wandered off, then it gets what it deserves. Got 99 sheep. So I'm going to go out there into the wilderness with all the wild animals and search high and low in the valleys of the shadows of death just to find that one lost sheep. I've got all these other 99. That was likely the answer the Pharisees and scribes would have given. And the reason we think that is because how the religious people were living their lives. They looked at the sheep who had nibbled their way lost. They looked at the people who found themselves to be lost in one way or another, and they didn't care. They didn't focus on trying to reach out to them, to befriend them, or to welcome them back home. All they focused on was to make sure that the 9 and 99 were comfortable. It was all about the 90 and 9. And for Jesus, it was just the opposite. It was about the lost sheep. Of course, Jesus cared about the 99% also, but he realized that he had a heart for the one lost sheep. He dedicated his entire life and ministry to them and to bring that one more, to find one more, to bring them back home into the fold of God. And if we follow the parable that Jesus is the shepherd, later he's referred to as the great shepherd, then he is the one who's going to go out into the wilderness after sundown where the wild animals are to find you. Jesus tells this story as a way to communicate to us that God still comes out, still searches for you relentlessly. Whenever we've wandered away and felt lost, whether if it's our own doing or circumstances beyond our own control, God is still searching. From birth, Jesus knows your name, and God's love and care is whispered into your ear in your baptism. In your baptism, God claims you and names you before God's people as one of God's own. And so when you lose your way, when you find yourselves lost, our God is the good shepherd who will search for you. God looks for you. God longs to lead you back. And God is still saying, come back, my little lamb. And Jesus says that he will call you by name and that the sheep recognize the voice of its shepherd. You know, sometimes it's said that sheep aren't the brightest animals in God's kingdom. However, sheep are actually quite smart. Sheep actually have an IQ of a cow. That's actually pretty high for a mammal. That's just beneath the IQ of a pig, and pigs are really smart. And pigs are just beneath dogs. Dogs are super smart. And so sheep are actually quite bright. In fact, sheep can recognize the facial expressions of the shepherd. It can tell if the shepherd is happy or sad just by looking at the shepherd's face. The sheep can also be trained to know their own names. So a shepherd can train their sheep to respond to its own name. And over time, the sheep will begin to recognize the shepherd's voice and it will respond to their shepherd's voice. But if I call the name, the lamb wouldn't come to me. It would, however, go to the shepherd when they hear their shepherd's voice. Jesus would have known this in his day, which is why Jesus said, my sheep know my voice and I know them. I call their name and they come to me. Jesus goes on to say something else. He said, when the shepherd found the sheep in the wilderness, he laid it on his shoulder and he rejoices. But don't you love this picture, this image of Jesus coming out into the wilderness and doing all he can to search for us? And when he finally reaches us, puts us on his shoulders. You've seen this depicted in art before, Jesus carrying a sheep upon his shoulders. Shepherds actually bind the feet of the sheep together so that when the sheep is being carried, the sheep can relax against the arms of its shepherd. And this is the picture that Jesus gives us of when we're finally found and returned back to God. God takes you in his arms and he holds you close, and once more you're safe and secure. In John 20:11, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, the shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. This is a profound and staggering idea that the shepherd is willing to face the wolves of the wilderness, even as we wander, just in order to save his own sheep. And so when Jesus came to be the good shepherd for us, he lays down his life for us on the cross. And from the cross, Jesus shows us how he takes on all of the anger and resentment, all of the grief and the loss, all of the estrangement and loneliness of this world. He takes on all of that. And from the cross, Jesus cries out, "This is how much I love you. Come back, little lambs, come back." And he lays his life down for his sheep. Today's parable is about the relentless love of God and how God never gives up on us, how Jesus longs to draw us near. And so patiently and persistently, Christ pursues us. There's no place you could go. There's no place that you could go that God himself wouldn't be willing to go and to find you. God willingly suffered and died just to show you the depth of God's love. And so when he's on the cross, he doesn't say anything about what we can do to earn it or to somehow be more deserving of a place in God's heart. He simply says, "Remember me. Remember that with me you are never lost. Remember that I know your name and I will always look for you and I will always lead you home. Remember how much the shepherd loves you and live differently in response." I'm going to close out today's message with a story of what God's relentless love looks like in our lives and to live differently as a response to God's relentless love. There was once a little girl named Marianne Bird. Marianne was born with some birth defects. She had a cleft palate and she was deaf in one ear. She had a disfigured face and a lopsided foot. But as she was growing up, she said that the worst thing was not all those disabilities. The worst thing was the torment that she got from the children in her school. She was mocked and treated and teased by her classmates. And she said the worst day of the school year was the day that they gave the hearing tests. She lived in a time before I did. When I was growing up, we didn't have a test like this. If we did, we went into a private room. We had earphones on. You'd raise your right hand or left hand as you heard the sounds. But in Marianne's day, the teacher would call each student up to the front of the classroom. And the teacher would whisper something in the little girl's ear, and then the child would speak back what they heard. Marianne said that every year when the teacher would whisper something into her ear, she couldn't quite make out what the teacher was whispering, but she was forced to recite back to the class whatever whisper it is that she thought she heard. Of course, it was never right on, so all the children would giggle and laugh at the girls whose face was disfigured and could hardly hear. Finally, Marianne was in one of the best classes of the school. She had the best teacher in the entire school, and that teacher's name was Miss Leonard. And then on the day Miss Leonard called all the children forward to do the hearing test, Marianne said it was her turn, and she was terrified. She was waiting for what was going to happen next. She said that the teacher usually whispered something in the children's ear like, "The sky is blue." And the child would repeat back, "The sky is blue." Or she would say, "I have new shoes." And then the child would repeat back, "I have new shoes." That day in class, Marianne said that when she had gotten called forward, Miss Leonard leaned into her good ear on the other side to whisper something. But Miss Leonard that day, she didn't whisper that the sky was blue or that she had new shoes. And now in Marianne's own words, she said, "I waited for those words. The words which she spoke were words that God himself must have spoken through her mouth. For the 7 words she whispered in my ear that day changed my life." She whispered, "I wish you were my little girl." And Marianne said that those words, that someone actually wanted her and loved her, it changed everything. Friends, the good shepherd is whispering. The great shepherd is calling your name and saying, "I wish you were my little girl. I wish you were my little boy. I wish you were my little lamb. Come home, little lambs. Come home." Amen.